The audience was buzzing before the cameras even rolled. The network had hyped it for days. A transatlantic discussion on progress and power. What they didn't advertise was that sparks were about to fly. On one side of the polished round table sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, calm, poised, draped in her signature white blazer. She was here not just as a U.S. Congresswoman, but as the voice of a progressive global future. To many in the room, she was the hero. To one man, she was the problem. Across from her sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim leader of Burkina Faso and symbol of a rising defiance across the global south. He wasn't wearing a suit, he didn't need to. A military green uniform and a piercing stare were more than enough to command the room. From the moment the moderator opened the floor, it was clear this wouldn't be polite diplomacy. "We share common goals," Ocasio-Cortez began smoothly. "Environmental justice, economic equity, human rights. But we can't solve global challenges without shared values, democracy, diversity, equality." Traoré's expression didn't shift. He let her finish. Then his voice cut through the studio like a blade. "You say shared values. Whose values?" "Yours," he asked, looking directly at her. "Because when your values come with drones and conditions, they're not shared. They're imposed." A ripple moved through the panel. Ocasio-Cortez gave a tight smile. "With all due respect, Captain Traoré, we stand for universal principles. Freedom, opportunity—" "Freedom?" Traoré interrupted. "Like the kind Libya had? Like the freedom Iraq still buries its dead under?" The moderator jumped in, but it was too late. The tone was set. Then came the spark that ignited it all. Ocasio-Cortez, her voice calm but edged with condescension, turned and said, "Captain, I understand that some societies have different traditions, but clinging to militarism, to religious conservatism, it's not progress. It's fear dressed as pride." Silence. Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his eyes burning. "You mock what you do not understand. Our values, faith, discipline, sovereignty, they built civilizations before yours had borders, and I will defend them, not with fear, with fire." The room went quiet. Even the moderator hesitated. Ocasio-Cortez looked stunned, not because he was angry, but because he was certain. And for the first time that night, the audience leaned in, not toward the American Congresswoman, but toward the man they didn't expect to agree with. The next segment was supposed to be about climate cooperation, but the atmosphere in the studio had already shifted. The air was thick, not with debate, but with confrontation. A producer whispered into the moderator's earpiece, "Stay neutral. Don't lose the audience." He tried to pivot. "Let's bring this back to solutions. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, how do you envision partnership with nations like Burkina Faso in addressing global environmental threats?" She exhaled, resetting herself. "We believe that by supporting sustainable development, green energy, clean water, education, we empower regions to become part of a global future. But that means aligning with shared frameworks, like the Paris Agreement. And yes, that means accountability." She glanced at Traoré with practiced diplomacy. "Without accountability, we risk authoritarianism dressed as independence." That was it. Traoré tapped his fingers once on the table. His voice, lower now, was more dangerous. "You speak of partnerships," he said, "but what you mean is permission. You want to help us, but only if we sign your documents, adopt your language, and obey your rules." He turned to the audience, most of whom were Western journalists, academics, and a few invited African delegates. "Let me tell you something," he said. "We have sun, wind, rivers, and young minds. We do not need lectures from nations that poison their own skies and now want to sell us guilt in recyclable packaging." Ocasio-Cortez tried to interject. "Respectfully, no one is selling guilt. We're offering cooperation." "You're offering control," he shot back, wrapped in soft words. The moderator froze. The audience didn't. They were hooked. Then, unexpectedly, Traoré reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a contract your USAID proposed to us last year. Solar development funds, on the condition that we allow American oversight boards to manage distribution, messaging, and even local school content." He placed it gently on the table. "Is that cooperation or colonization in a green suit?" Ocasio-Cortez blinked. She hadn't seen it coming. She wasn't briefed on that deal. Her aides behind the scenes were already scrambling. Still, she smiled, tightly. "Corruption is real, Captain. Oversight ensures progress reaches the people, not the pockets of generals." It was meant to land as a jab, but it missed. Traoré didn't even blink. "My people sleep under stars your cities can't see through smog. If you think oversight is your price for light, keep your funds. We'll find our own dawn." A pause, a few gasps, a few cheers. The cameras kept rolling. The world was watching something rare. Not a debate, a reckoning. By the third segment, social media was already ablaze. Clips of Traoré's last line, "Keep your funds. We'll find our own dawn," were circulating with millions of views, mostly from unexpected corners of the internet. In the studio, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez adjusted her tone. Her advisors were signaling from offstage, "Don't lose composure. Reclaim control." "I want to be clear," she began, facing both Traoré and the audience. "I'm not here to insult your country or your culture, but when your government shuts down press outlets, jails dissenters, and militarizes civil society, it's hard not to raise questions." Traoré remained still. She continued, "Power that fears criticism isn't strength, it's insecurity." It was a sharp line. The audience nodded, but Traoré didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her in a way that suggested something deeper than disagreement. It was disappointment. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "You confuse silence with oppression," he said. "In your country, people shout over each other until no one hears a word. In mine, we listen, then we speak." He leaned in, unshaken. "Yes, we arrest foreign-funded provocateurs, not because they dissent, but because they deceive. You think every man with a protest sign is a freedom fighter, but sometimes they are the first spark in a fire set by outsiders." Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, but Traoré raised a hand. "You invaded countries for less than what you accuse us of," he said. "You weaponize democracy. You export it like fast food, cheap, addictive, and void of nutrition." The moderator broke in. Let's steer back to the topic of international collaboration." "No," Traoré said firmly. "Let's not. Let's talk about how your values become bombs, how your freedom becomes surveillance, how your equality skips over Congo and lands in Silicon Valley," Ocasio-Cortez countered, her tone sharpening. "And yet here you are, using a global platform provided by the very system you reject." That landed, but Traoré welcomed it. "Exactly," he replied. "You built the stage. I came to show you we no longer need your script." The room was silent again, this time not out of shock, but because they understood something had shifted. This wasn't a clash of countries, it was a clash of civilizations. The tension in the room was no longer awkward. It was electric. Cameras panned across the audience, catching faces frozen somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Ocasio-Cortez wasn't used to being on the defensive, but she knew when to adapt. She leaned back, composed, her voice softer now but pointed. "Let me ask you something, Captain," she said. "If your ideas are so powerful, why are so many of your youth fleeing your countries, risking oceans, deserts, and even death to get to the West?" The question cut deep. Some in the room nodded. A few murmured in agreement. Traoré didn't flinch. He stood, not out of anger but principle. He wasn't just speaking for himself now. He was speaking for millions. "Our youth don't flee Africa because of tradition or faith or discipline," he said. "They flee because your banks bled our economies. Your corporations drained our resources. Your weapons armed our wars." He turned toward the camera. "They flee what you left behind, not what we are." Ocasio-Cortez interjected quickly, trying to regain the rhythm. "There's no denying history, Captain. But we can't build the future on blame. We need accountability on all sides." Traoré nodded. "Then start with yours." The words dropped like a gavel. He continued, "You want to talk about migration? Let's talk about how your policies destabilized Libya, how you sanctioned entire nations into poverty, how your demand for rare earth minerals keeps hands in mud from sunup to sundown." He paused, then added quietly, "The only border Africans ever crossed willingly was their own, until ships came." Ocasio-Cortez was silent. For once, she wasn't sure how to respond. The moderator tried to pivot again, clearly sweating under the studio lights. "We're seeing a lot of emotion," he said nervously. "Perhaps we can refocus on common ground, maybe education or health partnerships." But Traoré didn't sit down. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez. "You mock my values," he said again, this time not in anger, but in sorrow. "But they are the last wall standing between my people and the flood of cultural emptiness you call modernity." The crowd didn't know whether to clap or remain silent. Some did both. And still, Traoré remained standing, calm, defiant, unshaken, not as a soldier, but as a guardian. By now, the studio had taken on the feel of something far greater than a televised panel. It felt more like a courtroom. History on trial, with two fierce attorneys arguing the soul of the future. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally stood too. If Traoré wanted to turn this into a symbolic battleground, she would meet him there. "I respect your passion," she said, "but it sounds more like a rejection of progress than a vision for it. You're defending tradition, yes, but when tradition stands in the way of human rights, we must ask, who benefits?" She stepped forward slightly. "Women in your country still face forced marriages. Journalists fear speaking freely. LGBTQ people live in hiding. Are those the values you're defending?" The audience murmured. Traoré's expression remained steady, but his jaw clenched. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up toward the rafters of the studio, as if weighing something heavier than the question. Then his voice dropped low and serious. "You assume your version of rights is universal, but what if your culture has confused freedom with chaos, expression with provocation, identity with fragmentation?" The room was quiet again. He continued, "In my land, family comes before self. Faith before politics, duty before desire. You see that as backward. But maybe it's what has kept us sane while the modern world burns in its own confusion." Ocasio-Cortez folded her arms. "So you admit it. You prioritize obedience over liberty." Traoré stepped toward her now, his tone hardening. "I prioritize order over the illusion of choice. I prioritize purpose over pleasure. And I prioritize sovereignty over being lectured by people whose own cities are drowning in division." There was no applause, but there was attention. Pure, undivided attention. He wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso now. He was speaking for every nation that had been told it must become a mirror image of the West or be deemed broken. Ocasio-Cortez took a step closer, refusing to back down. "You think your fire makes you strong, but fire can burn the very people you claim to protect. And your silence," Traoré replied, "lets wolves walk through the front door dressed as liberators." Now they were face to face. No podium, no moderator, just two visions of the world. And no one in the room dared to interrupt. The producers in the control room were panicking. "This is off script," one muttered. "No, this is gold," another whispered. On screen, two figures stood locked in moral combat. No talking points, no commercials, just ideology, raw and undiluted. Traoré turned slightly to the audience now, as if speaking not just to Ocasio-Cortez, but to everyone who had ever looked down on his continent with a smile that masked a leash. "I don't reject human rights," he said. "I reject your monopoly on defining them." He stepped toward the edge of the platform. "You believe in choice, so do we, but choice without roots leads to drift. You believe in freedom, so do we, but freedom without sacrifice leads to collapse. You call us traditional, but tradition is simply memory that refused to die." Some in the audience clapped, quietly at first, then with more confidence, not because they agreed with everything, but because they felt something rare: authenticity. Ocasio-Cortez wasn't finished. "And what of the young girl?" she asked. "Who wants to be more than what her father allows? What of the boy who's told to fight instead of dream? If your culture denies them, are you not imprisoning your own future?" Traoré nodded slowly. Her question was real. "We are not perfect," he admitted, "but we are ours. We are rising, not because we mimic you, but because we finally stopped." He took a breath. "For every girl denied school, there's another now building one. For every boy forced to fight, there are 100 more reclaiming peace. But we will not destroy our foundations to meet your expectations," Ocasio-Cortez responded, her voice softening but not retreating. "You speak of sovereignty, I speak of solidarity. You say fire, I say hope." Traoré's response was immediate. "Hope without humility becomes arrogance." Their eyes locked again. This was no longer just political, it was spiritual, a confrontation between the soul of a continent seeking dignity and the voice of a superpower seeking reform. And both, in their own way, were right. The cameras caught a rare moment. Not victory, not defeat, but mutual recognition. Then the moderator's voice returned, trembling slightly. "We'll now open the floor to questions from the global press." But no one in the room moved. No one wanted to follow that. The first reporter stood up, nervously clutching his notepad. His accent revealed he was from Belgium. His question, however, was anything but neutral. "Captain Traoré," he began, "critics say your defiance is just well-packaged authoritarianism, that beneath your rhetoric lies a regime that fears free thought. How do you respond to those who say you use sovereignty as a shield for suppression?" The air tightened. Traoré didn't blink. "I've heard that before," he said calmly, "usually right before a nation is invaded or sanctioned into hunger." He turned to the journalist. "Let me ask you, when your country banned hijabs, was that liberty? When you deported African migrants, was that equality? You want to see suppression? Look in your own mirror." The room stirred. The reporter sat down without follow-up. The next question came from an American journalist, this time directed at Ocasio-Cortez. "Congresswoman, do you believe America has the moral authority to lead global progress, given its history of interventions and internal divisions?" Ocasio-Cortez hesitated only a second. "Yes," she said firmly, "not because we're perfect, but because we confront our imperfections. Democracy is messy, but it's real, and that struggle is our strength." She glanced at Traoré. "Leadership doesn't mean domination. It means example." Traoré tilted his head, considering. "Then be honest about your example," he said. "Your cities burn with division. Your youth drown in distractions. You promote rights, but forget responsibility. You offer choice, but strip away meaning." The moderator stepped in again. "Let's move to closing thoughts." But the press wasn't finished. A young African woman stood. Her voice was clear, her posture brave. "My question is for both of you," she said. "What do you say to the next generation? Those of us caught between Western influence and ancestral identity?" That silenced them both. Ocasio-Cortez answered first, slowly. "I say, you don't have to choose. Take what empowers you from every tradition, and reject what oppresses you from any direction." Traoré waited, then spoke like a flame crackling in the dark. "I say, stand where your ancestors stood. Walk forward, but never forget their footsteps. The world doesn't need you to blend in. It needs you to remember who you are." The young woman sat, her eyes wet. In that moment, for the first time, neither Ocasio-Cortez nor Traoré looked like they wanted to win. They just didn't want to lose something deeper. After the questions ended, the official broadcast wrapped, but the tension hadn't. Neither Ocasio-Cortez nor Traoré left the stage. They stood side by side, microphones off, but eyes still locked in quiet combat. The cameras had stopped rolling, but the conversation hadn't. Ocasio-Cortez broke the silence. "You speak with conviction," she said, "but conviction can be dangerous when it shields you from reflection." Traoré looked out across the now empty audience chairs. "And reflection," he replied, "can become paralysis when it replaces action." She smiled slightly. "You think we're weak because we debate ourselves." He shook his head. "I think you're divided because you no longer believe in yourselves." She took a step closer, not to challenge, but to understand. "You really believe the West is crumbling?" "I believe it is burning," Traoré answered. "From within. You replaced purpose with pleasure, God with algorithms, wisdom with noise." He turned to face her fully. "And yet you look at us, still holding on to family, faith, discipline, and call us backwards." There was no malice in his voice, only mourning. Ocasio-Cortez lowered her gaze for a moment. "I don't want to erase your values, but we've seen where rigid tradition can lead, to silence, to fear, to violence. And I've seen where limitless freedom leads," he said, "to confusion, to loneliness, to nations that forget what they were." She took a deep breath. "So what then? Are we doomed to be opposites, forever clashing over whose truth is more true?" Traoré considered this. "No," he said. "We are not opposites. We are reminders. You remind us that change is possible. I remind you that not everything should change." A long silence passed between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Then Ocasio-Cortez said something unexpected. "Maybe if we both listen more and impose less, the world would heal faster." Traoré nodded. "And maybe," he replied, "if we both defended truth more and performed less, it would bleed less." For the first time that evening, they shared something resembling respect. It wasn't peace, but it was understanding. And in an age of noise, that was rare enough to matter. The debate had ended hours ago, but the world had only just begun reacting. Clips flooded every major social platform. Some hailed Traoré as a fierce defender of dignity. Others praised Ocasio-Cortez for standing firm in the face of fire. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just another panel discussion. It was a cultural earthquake. In Burkina Faso, crowds gathered around outdoor televisions, replaying Traoré's words like scripture. Elders nodded, youth cheered. For once, a leader had not begged for aid, but demanded respect. Meanwhile, in the West, the reactions were fractured. Some progressives accused Traoré of wrapping oppression in poetry. Some conservatives admitted, grudgingly, that he spoke truths their own leaders wouldn't dare voice. In private, Ocasio-Cortez met with her aides. "He was prepared," one muttered, flipping through notes. "More than we anticipated." "He didn't want applause," she said softly. "He wanted to be heard." They looked at her, surprised by the tone. "Do you think we were wrong?" one aide asked. She didn't answer right away. "I think we underestimated what it feels like to be talked about for decades, and finally be talked to." Across the ocean, Traoré walked alone through the courtyard of the presidential compound in Ouagadougou. The moon was high, but he wasn't tired. His phone buzzed endlessly. Journalists, politicians, ministers, foreign embassies. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he sat on a wooden bench beneath an old baobab tree. A soldier approached him. "Captain, your speech. It moved the people. They're calling it the night Burkina spoke back." Traoré didn't smile. He simply said, "They needed to know we don't have to apologize for who we are." "And the woman?" the soldier asked. "The American?" "She came with fire," Traoré said. "But so did we. Sometimes fire isn't to destroy, it's to warn or to remind. He looked up at the stars. I don't hate her. She believes in her truth. So do I. But I will never trade my people's soul for applause in another man's hall. The soldier nodded and walked away. And Traoré remained seated, a man alone with his thoughts, not as a symbol, but as a sentinel, a quiet force in a world that had finally unmistakably heard him speak. Weeks passed. The debate faded from headlines, but not from memory. Universities dissected it. Diplomats referenced it. Commentators on both sides of the aisle revisited every word, every pause, every glance between the two figures who had turned a stage into a battlefield of ideas. But for Traoré and Ocasio-Cortez, the impact was more personal. They didn't speak again directly, not through official channels, but something had shifted. In Washington, Ocasio-Cortez delivered a floor speech unlike any she'd given before. She didn't mention Traoré by name, but the echo was unmistakable. We talk about progress like it's a one-size-fits-all garment, she said, but maybe true justice means asking who gets to define the size and who's never been invited into the fitting room. It drew a standing ovation from some and side eyes from others. In Ouagadougou, Traoré issued a public directive, a new education initiative combining local history, African philosophy, and modern science, without reliance on foreign consultants. It was his way of answering the young woman's question from that night. The headline in a regional newspaper read, "Knowledge without shame, growth without imitation." Meanwhile, the youth were talking in Harlem cafes and Lagos classrooms, on TikTok and Telegram, in dorms, barbershops, open markets. What made the moment live on wasn't just the clash. It was the collision of two kinds of sincerity. One from a woman who believed fiercely in a better world, through reform, through rights, through universal ideals. One from a man who believed in the weight of memory, the sanctity of culture, and the danger of becoming someone else just to be accepted. Their confrontation was not a finale. It was a spark. For some, it raised fear. What if the global South stops listening? For others, it raised hope. What if they finally speak with their own voice? Back in Burkina Faso, an elderly village chief was asked by a reporter what he thought of Traoré's now legendary defense. The old man smiled. He spoke like a son of the soil, not to win, not to please, just to remind the world that roots still matter. In a time where everything is questioned, that was something worth remembering. And maybe, just maybe, worth defending. What began as a debate ended as a declaration. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came to defend the ideals of the modern world: freedom, inclusion, progress. Ibrahim Traoré stood to defend the soul of a civilization: honor, tradition, sovereignty. Neither side walked away unchanged. In a time when dialogue is too often replaced with shouting and diplomacy is reduced to slogans, two voices clashed, not for dominance, but for definition. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming the right to define who we are and who we refuse to become. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't agreement, it's resistance. And sometimes the most important fire is the one that doesn't burn down, but burns within.